We take ourselves quite seriously. We consider our identities to be both real and precious. And that which we identify with is what we protect. It seems that who we are is a solid, substantial thing that is worth defending. When we talk to each other, sometimes we notice that so-and-so isn't making much sense right now. They believe things that aren't true, not able to see reality. In general, when that happens, it's because we have an attachment to ourselves that is greater than our interest in reality. And if we were to see reality, then it would dislodge, disrupt, disturb our sense of self. We hold very tightly to this sense of self. And if something comes up that doesn't support the story we tell about ourselves, that becomes a problem. That becomes the enemy. Now, the extreme case of this is simply the fact of death, the fact of impermanence. This is very problematic for myself. And so we fear it. We make it into an enemy. Death is the enemy, then time is the enemy. If time is the enemy, then everything is the enemy, and we live our lives in a constant state of saying no to everything, afraid of having experiences, and we live little tight lives as a result. What we don't see is that identity is fluid. Self, ego, our sense of who we are is fluid. It changes. And in fact, what we believe we are is very different from place to place, culture to culture, community to community. In some cultures, we feel that we're individuals, separated from others who have autonomy. We have rights. Nowadays, in the modern world, humanism, the worship of human beings, has become the dominant religion that we follow. And the priests of that religion are called therapists, psychologists and psychotherapists are the priests of that religion. We go to them for confession. We go to them to receive guidance on what we should do. And of course, the way they guide us is by telling us to listen to ourselves. How do you feel about this? And what's happening within you? Because if you truly understand that, then you truly understand how to live. Because you are the measure of all things. You are the most important thing in the universe. And what you feel is right. What you want to do is what you should do. And if you truly understand what you want. And in the code, in the official doctrine that psychotherapists must take in order to become certified. They commit to maintaining the client's autonomy. That's a commitment that has to be made. It's the therapist's responsibility to indoctrinate people with a sense of autonomy. In this country, anyway, where we believe in individualism, we actually make it into something that the people to whom we go and are most vulnerable are required to indoctrinate us with. You have autonomy. You have to make your own decisions. Other places, this is not only considered, well, absurd. Obviously, it's not true, but it's actually considered evil to look at things in this way. One example, of course, is cultures in which community is taken to be our basic identity. We basically identify with a group, maybe with a family, maybe with a clan, maybe with a certain religion, but we identify as a community. And if we go to the vast majority of world cultures, although these cultures are being destroyed at a great rate, but the vast majority of human cultures through history and even today, if you consider just numbers, even though there are very few people in these cultures, the number of cultures is actually quite high. We see things in this way. But our basic identity is as one part of a vast network of living things. We identify with nature. And that isn't something that's just a theory. It's important to understand this. This isn't just a theory. In the same way that if people go to us and ask us who you are, you can come up with lots of theories about, well, I'm really deeply interconnected with all things, but what you really perceive, if you've been brought up in this culture, is that you're an individual, whatever theories you may have. The same way, if you go to someone who's grown up in a culture of interconnectedness, they may say, well, I'm me, of course, look at me, I'm not you. And yet, the direct perception is one of interconnectedness, oneness. The way such a person sees a tree, the way the tree is seen, what is perceived when one sees a tree is actually different from what's perceived by a person who's fully indoctrinated in our culture. What is seen is different. What is felt is different. The perception is different. It's not just the theory that's different. The experience is different. Before theory, before consideration. What we identify with, this is the strongest force that warps our perception, that guides our perception. Because any perception that fails to support our identity is the enemy. That perception is the enemy. Now, of course, this is very difficult for us because these identities that we hold are false. And therefore, perception itself becomes the enemy. The entire universe becomes the enemy. And we live, as Robert Thurman said, in a perpetual battle with the entire universe that I will inevitably lose. That's how we live, in a perpetual battle with the entire universe that I will eventually lose, inevitably, without fail. Naturally, here, as we train, as we go deeper and deeper, we cut through every kind of identity, every kind of ego, every sense of self. We do that by giving up that conflict, and when that is done, that conflict is totally abandoned. With that comes peace, true peace. On that peace, a new culture can be built. Now, why would we build that culture? Why would we do that? Why would we create a culture that guides, constructs, sculpts a sense of identity? Why would that be? If that's false, why would we create it? Why would we talk about it at all? Because the fact is that we are stuck. We do grasp onto a sense of self. And which sense of self matters? It matters. Which warping of reality we subject ourselves to matters. How we filter our perception matters. Right now, we're filtering our perception, we're warping our experience in such a way that we become increasingly capable and increasingly likely to destroy life. That has been happening for tens of thousands of years in a general trend. Of course, not perfectly consistently, but that's been the general trend. We here take upon ourselves the shocking responsibility to go against the stream of the world, against the pattern of the world, against the current of the world. In terms of our subjective experience, we go against the tendency of tens of thousands of years of increasingly egotistical perception, increasingly solidified sense of self. Until, as we say, we've gotten to the point now when the worship of ourselves is our religion. So on the one side, in terms of our subjective experience, we commit to cutting through the tendency to maintain an increasingly solidified and delusional sense of self. In terms of our objective behavior, we commit to going against the current of tens of thousands of years and stop destroying life, and on the contrary, protect it, allow life to flourish. So that we human beings are no longer the strongest fortress fighting for the delusional, egotistical sense of self on this planet, and we are no longer the most damaging life form in the world. We're going against that here. That's what we commit to. And how do we commit to it? By changing our sense of self, changing our behaviors to be respectful of all life, by creating a new culture. Because while it's true that whatever we identify with, that is what we will protect, our culture has a vast influence on what it is that we identify with. I've traveled a great deal. I've lived in several cultures. And I, at one point, was giving a talk about my travels, and as many of you have noticed, I'm typically quite complimentary of the places that I trained. Of course, there are problems, but I don't see a large reason. I don't see a significant reason to talk about that at length. Prefer to talk about what I gained from those experiences, what I'd like to share. But at the end of one talk, a certain individual asked me specifically, well, okay, you say lots of good things about these Zen masters and these other teachers who you've trained with in various cultures, but tell me what's wrong with them. What's bad about them? That's a valid question. So I answered it. I said, well, the basic problem that I've seen as I've traveled is that people, and even very deep, realized people, still tend to have difficulty telling the difference between spirituality and their culture. As many of you know, I was a monk in Japan, I was a monk in India, I was a monk in a few other places, but if we just take those two, being a monk in those two cultures is completely different. I had to be a different person. And I had to be, in the end, a quintessential Japanese person, a quintessential Indian person. Why? Because in both places, the cultural norms, the cultural values are taken to be spiritual values, ultimate truth. And so in order to be a good monk, you have to be a good whatever that culture is. And I said, in my experience, it's very difficult for people, even very impressive people, to truly tell the difference between their culture and spirituality. The way I put it is that at the very bottom, there's spiritual truth. At the top, there's all of our delusions, all of our drama. I don't like this person, and I wish I had that thing. All of that is at the top of our minds. At the very bottom, there's spiritual truth. You can go down deeper than our personal issues that we're having today, a little bit to our personalities, our personal personalities. You can go a little bit deeper than that to what our experiences of a lifetime. I had this thing happen and that thing happen. And you go down and down. And in my experience with human beings, the layer just above spiritual truth is our cultural norms. And those assumptions then create a sense of self. The underlying tendency to a sense of self is another issue, but which self is to a large extent determined by these cultural norms. So that's what I said, and she felt very satisfied with that. She said, that's true. Those people really do have trouble telling the difference between, I've traveled too, and I also have noticed that they have a lot of trouble telling the difference between their culture and ultimate truth. So then I think you can all imagine the quandary that I found myself in. How shall I respond to that statement, I wondered. Well, you all know me well enough to predict, to guess what happened. I just couldn't help but say, and your question demonstrates exactly the same thing. I left it at that. I didn't go into detail. But in our culture, we have a tendency to look for those problems, especially in spiritual teachers. There's a distrust there because secular humanism has indoctrinated us with that distrust. It's very reasonable. Our modern priests, scientists and such, may have an idea of truth now that has nothing to do with ethics. A scientist can make a discovery and do something unethical, and that unethical thing has absolutely no bearing on whether their discovery is considered to be true or not. That way they have a great advantage over other leaders who give a different kind of truth that has to be both accurate and beneficial in order to be true. Not just factual, but also beneficial. And if such a person, such as us here, if we say, I've made a spiritual discovery, but then we act in unethical ways, it casts that discovery in doubt. People feel like, oh, that person probably didn't make a real discovery. But in that way, we're also in a position of strength, because that's what people really care about. It's our job to be sure that we find a kind of truth that is given, that can be formed into a kind of culture that is beneficial, and that is actually based on something prior to, underneath, more basic than, independent of our cultural assumptions. To have the courage to cut down through that, to have the courage to cut down through our identity, the specific identity we've taken on, and that gives us the possibility to cut through the underlying tendency to become attached to self in the first place. The underlying tendency to grasp onto a view of myself. With that realization comes freedom. Why? Because, as Master Sheng Yen said, until awakening, every thought you have is subtly imbued and controlled by the desire to protect yourself. Every thought, every perception is subtly directed towards preservation of self. Every thought is subtly self-centered until we've broken through and realized the meaninglessness of that battle, the battle of self-preservation. From there, we can bring forth a sense of self for a completely different reason, that being compassion. Bring forth self as a tool, not as a master. Not as the enemy of the entire world, but on the contrary, as that which gives life to the entire world by connecting with the entire world in love. With that comes the possibility to produce a new kind of culture, with that a new kind of community, a community which benefits life on earth and simultaneously gives us a sense of self that guides us to freedom. This is the task, the mission that we've set forth for this organization. And those who come here and sacrifice their lives for it, those who support this work, truly are heroes. And even though it may not be that all living things have human language to say thank you, we know as we come to die that we haven't made enemies with any of them, and the love that we have lived carries us beyond ourselves into a joy and a peace that absolutely transcends the human mind.